It's summer, which means it's travel time. I made myself a travel pillow and a sleeping mask for the road, and I couldn't resist giving them a nice sleepy Totoro look. To make the pattern for the pillow, I taped two big pieces of paper together and I folded it in half. I sketched out a shape for the pillow that I thought would work. And this isn't an exact science, you can just work out a shape that looks good to you. I measured around my neck and I checked if the pillow wouldn't be too tight on the inside. I then added 1.5 centimeters of seam allowance all the way around. This is my master pattern. If you want, you could move straight on to cutting fabric and sewing from here. But of course I want to make my pillow look like Totoro's belly, so I'm going to divide the pattern into two pieces. I drew a shape for Totoro's belly that I liked and I grabbed some pattern paper. I folded this paper in half as well and lined up the fold with the fold in the master pattern. I traced the inside piece and continued the seam allowance all the way around. I did the same for the outside piece. Now I have two pattern pieces that together will form the complete pillow. I pinned the outer piece to a double layer of grey fabric. I cut it out, giving me two identical pieces. I pinned the inner piece to an old t-shirt from the second-hand store. I cut it out, again ending up with two identical pieces. To attach the inner and outer pieces to each other, I marked the center points with pins. I placed the pieces right sides together and pinned them along the curve. Pinning opposite curves like these can be a bit tricky. It helps if you use a lot of pins and move the top piece in line with the bottom piece bit by bit. I sewed all the way around, making sure the fabric wasn't folded over where I was sewing. I cut small notches into the seam allowance along the curve to take the pressure off the fabric and help it lie flat. I repeated the pinning, sewing and notching for the other side of the pillow. My ends didn't line up completely, probably because one of the fabrics is much more stretchy than the other. So I cut the ends to line up better. This changes the shape of my pillow a little bit, but I'm okay with that. I'm adding 3 chevron shapes to each side. I cut the shapes a bit bigger than I wanted them, so that I can fold the edges under and get a nice clean look. Because these fabrics are so stretchy, I hand stitched these pieces on. I used a double thread for extra strength and I kept folding the edges of the fabric underneath. I used a simple whip stitch here. Now the pieces are ready for final assembly. I placed them right sides together and pinned them to each other. I then sewed all the way around, but leaving a gap of around the width of my hand for stuffing. I again cut notches in the seam allowance and then I turned the pillow inside out and stuffed it with polyester filling. To close the pillow, I folded the seam allowances inside and used a ladder stitch, going back and forth between the two sides. This leaves a nearly invisible seam. For the sleeping mask, I again started with drawing a pattern. I made a few paper mock-ups to try and minimize the amount of light seeping in by my nose, until I ended up with my final design. To make the mask look like Totoro, I drew an ear pattern for him and figured out the design for his face. Seeing it all together made me decide to make his ears a bit bigger. I added 1.5 centimeters of seam allowance and this finishes the pattern. I pinned the pattern to a leftover piece of fabric from the pillow and cut it out. I cut a second piece out of black fleece, which will be the soft inside of the mask. For the ears, I copied the shape onto the fabric twice, folded the fabric over and roughly cut around them, giving me 4 pieces. For this type of precision work, I'll be using the chalk line as a stitching guide instead of a set seam allowance. For the ears, I placed 2 pieces of fabric right sides together and stitched on top of the chalk line, leaving the bottom open. I then trimmed the seam allowance down, cut notches around the curves and turned the ears inside out. For Totoro's nose, I cut a piece of black fleece in the right shape and again I used a whip stitch to attach it to his face. I'm not folding the edges under here, since fleece holds its shape very well and it doesn't ravel. For Totoro's sleepy eyes, his mouth and his whiskers, I'm using embroidery. I simply made multiple small stitches in a row with thick black embroidery thread. For the eyes and mouth I use two lines right next to each other, but the whiskers are single lines. I placed the mask pieces right sides together and pinned them down. I then placed the ears in between, pointing towards the inside. I marked the location where the elastic will be, and I stitched all the way around, leaving a gap on each of the sides for the elastic. I trimmed down the seam allowance and cut notches again to help the fabric around the curves. I then turned the mask right side out through one of the gaps for the elastic and folded the seam allowance inside. I placed a piece of white elastic inside one of the gaps and stitched it closed. I checked the length of the elastic and then placed the other end in the other gap. After stitching this one closed too, the mask is done. And that completes my Sleepy Totoro travel kit. After seeing it, my husband quickly put in a request for his own travel kit, so I made him this Psyduck kit of his own.
I hope you all enjoyed this project. I know I really like the results and I'm very happy with them, and I look forward to using them soon. If you enjoyed this video, then please let me know by leaving me a like or a comment down below, and of course subscribe to my channel if you want to see my future videos. If it's summer where you're from, then I hope you have a great summer with lots of sunshine, and I'll see you in my next video.